Hi everyone, GM Kraai here, and I wanted to share with you today a game that I feel illustrates the nature of the struggle that will happen if you follow my easy system against the French. And I'm very gratified that many people watched it and are now playing it. And today we have Luke and Kevin, who regularly submit to my chess.com show. You can submit your game. It's the end of the month, every last Wednesday. And I cover people's games on the show. And so Luke submitted this game, and we're going to look at it now a little bit. And the first thing I want to say is that in the comment section to the system against the French, some people noted that bishop d7. They correctly noted that bishop d3 now doesn't work nearly as well because now they can take and they haven't committed to queen b6. And there was a reason I didn't cover it, and that's just because myself, being a French player, I never took bishop d7 that seriously. And so there's a simple way to understand how to play against bishop d7, and that is that black, when he plays bishop d7, is not getting a jump on attacking this weak pawn, which is going to be, like we said in the other video, the essence, the whole nature of the struggle for black is to put pressure on that point before white consolidates his center. And so what white can do now is just play bishop e2 and castles. For example, here, here, and knight e7, we can play dc like in the other variation. So if you take, the big issue now is we get this square, and we're going to play knight a4, and it's actually kind of a very nice advantage. So to put it just in a way that you can remember it, is that if you played, let's say, queen b6, bishop e2, also a move, but now there's the key difference that on knight e7, knight f5, you're not in time with knight a4 because there's going to be checks on bishop b4, and this is an ancient variation where black is fine. So, with that out of the way, let's get into this game. Queen b6, bishop d3. C takes. Good move. Remember, if they play bishop d7, this is already a nice advantage for white, and most people are going to fall for that. So, C takes, castles. And remember, part of my psychological reasoning for doing this, it hit me because as a French player myself, I've always felt uncomfortable in this Milner-Berry gambit kind of position, like this, and white plays knight c3. Sometimes they take on d4 first. Excuse me, I blew that. See, it's actually instructive that I made the mistake. Of course, black has to play bishop d7 first. And in this position, you know, we can get this business here. And sometimes you can take on d4 first. But the point is the French player, I felt always pretty uncomfortable with that. And this system that I devised here, other players, it turns out, had played it. I didn't realize it. I just kind of came up with my head. And part of the key idea is that if they take on c3, it will simply develop our knight. So we're getting rid of the weak d4 point, and we're going to develop the knight. Well, Kevin was very well prepared, and let's look what he did. Bishop d7, rook e1. Good move. We're waiting for him to take, and he correctly says, no, I'm not going to take the pawn on d4. And here, Luke follows my advice and plays knight d2. And this is where it's truly, let's call it an interesting idea, because when now he takes, the point is that c3 pawn will be a monster in terms of controlling the center and dominating that knight on c6. Of course, we're also going to get rook b1 as a free tempo. So a very interesting pawn sacrifice. Okay, here we go. Rook b1, castles. Now, here's where we're going to get into what we should call theory or something like that. In the video, I believe I looked at this, and White has very nice play. It's very difficult for black to take on e5. And what I said as a rule of thumb was that if he castles, you should play h4. And that's exactly what Luke does. And we're going to look at that, but I just want to say that it also makes a lot of sense in this position to first consolidate, well, I won't say consolidate, to move your knight on b3 because you really do want to move that guy eventually anyway. So, for example, it could have gone knight d4, queen c7, and queen e2, and our intention will very much be to play h4 on the next move. And also just to say that black does not have any great improving moves himself. And if he takes, what we're going to say is our center is very firm, and that the extra pawn on the queen side really doesn't mean that much. And we are going to play moves like h4 with the initiative very soon. Now, that said, let's look at Luke's move, because it is also very reasonable, and it is what I said. I said if the guy castles, you hit him with Harry the h-pawn. So here we go. Queen c7. And here's an interesting psychological moment. Let me read to you what Luke said. This move made me pause for almost 30 minutes because I was doubting my preparation. I wanted to play knight bd4, and I kept calculating, but it never worked. So he ends up playing queen e2, absolutely correct. And we're going to go down now a line where both players, I feel, play very strong chess. Black must deal with h5. If the knight gets kicked back, white will be simply much, much better. So f6, good move. And I like what Luke plays here, and it turns out to be very forcing. He could have also taken this way and gotten an interesting position like this. And Nimzovich has a position like this, and I think it's my system where, you're going to get these two blockading knights, and it's an interesting dynamic position. So that's an option for white too. But I like, in principle, very much what Luke did. Luke said, I'm not going to give you my bishop. Rook f6, bishop g5, very good. Knight f4, also the strongest move for black. Both sides playing very precisely here. Queen e3, rook f7, snip, rook takes. Now let's just observe something. The compensation at this point is that we got his dark square bishop and that his king is worse. It is a little funny that our h4 pawn is wondering a little bit what it's doing there, but we're going to come back to that question in a second. Knight c5, very good. b6 seems forced, and then we take. Okay, now a critical moment where Kevin blunders, and I want to say about this blunder as a French player especially, when you're put under this kind of stress, it is very easy to make a mistake. The guy, as far as I can tell, has played 20 moves of very good chess so far, so it's not surprising that he finally makes a mistake. But I want to disagree a little bit with the way Luke assesses what Kevin should have done, and also maybe the ethos, if I can, to speak that way about the position. Rook d7 was played, and we'll show that, but Luke says, well, on knight d3, he says, I was expecting he would play knight d3 and I would contend in a worse position. And I have to say, I am not at all certain that this is a worse position. In fact, I think it's very much in line with what we are trying, the kinds of things we're trying to do in this opening. For example, queen takes, and here white has two very promising continuations, and I'm not even sure which one's best. But one thing I want to stress, as a French player, I would be unhappy with both of these situations. You can play c4 first, or you can start off with knight g5. And both are just a little unpleasant, especially after g6, my king will be permanently unsafe. And especially in a practical game, what you should realize is that the king being unsafe really will create a situation where it's much easier for black to go down, because mistakes will be made by both sides in this kind of position, and the king is simply always open. And c4 in this position, of course, leaves the option of knight g5 open. Okay, so I think both of those positions, c4, knight g5, are actually pretty good end positions for what we might hope for if black plays perfectly in this setup, where we have a very promising initiative for the pawn. Let's look at the mistake. Rook d7, bishop b5, very nice move. And now all of a sudden, he is suffering from real French problems, namely the e6 pawn and the e5 square, the key blockade square that white is going to want to work with. So rook d f7, and here white is totally winning. Knight f3, of course, didn't do much. e6 is hanging, and here Luke criticizes gf4 and says knight g5, but I think gf4 was also winning. I will include this full game if you want to see how the full game panned out at the bottom in the description. And I also want to say, and this is to address to the players like Luke, who I think the following might be true, that you are uncomfortable with sacrificing the pawn. Now, there's two things about that. One, if you are uncomfortable sacrificing the pawn, this is not the system for you, okay, and that's okay. Well, I'm going to say three things. It's not the system for you, and I have a dull way to kill the French in another system, and I'm going to link to that system also in the description. But finally, as a final note, I do want to say that as a chess player, I think a good piece of advice is that you want to learn how to play with sacrificing the pawn, even if you feel uncomfortable with it. That doesn't mean that you should try to go into these positions if you don't enjoy them, but that you should sense, really, that you've got great play in a position as we finished here with either knight g5 or c4, both long-term initiatives. All right, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.